We have a truly distinguished panel who will offer their reflections shortly. But before we get underway, I should note that this is Hudson Institute's 50th anniversary year, and to mark this occasion, the Institute has begun a 50th anniversary seminar series, and today's exceptional book forum is the second event in this series. This is altogether appropriate, as Irving Kristol played a role in the history of Hudson Institute, formally as a trustee and informally as a mentor, teacher, and beloved friend to so many of us here today.
Irving Kristol's life story is, in its own way, a very American story. Born into a poor Jewish family in Brooklyn, New York, he rose to become founder, manager, editor, and/or publisher of more magazines than most people read in a lifetime. Irving Kristol was not only the father of neoconservatism, he was a friend and mentor. And along with the remarkable B. Kristol, the intellectual North Pole on the course of our history and civilization. The Neoconservative Persuasion, edited by Kristol's widow, the indeed remarkable historian Gertrude Himmelfarb, comprises almost 50 of Kristol's hitherto uncollected essays spanning 7 decades. As Kristol himself asserts in the titular essay written in 2003, Neoconservatism, quote, is not a movement, as the conspiratorial critics would have it. It is a persuasion, one that manifests itself over time, but erratically, and one whose meaning we clearly glimpse only in retrospect. Or, as Ms. Himmelfarb explains in her introduction, quote, if neoconservative is not, as Kristol repeatedly insisted, a movement or an ideology, let alone a party, it is something more, a moral perspective deriving from a broad spectrum of ideas, beliefs, and sentiments that inform politics, to be sure, but also culture, religion, economics, and much else. As our speakers are probably well known to most of you, and as you will find more biographical information about them in the handouts at your seats, I will but briefly introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Pulitzer Prize-winning syndicated columnist and political commentator Charles Krauthammer will be our first speaker, and he will reflect on Kristol's thought about foreign policy. Director of Hudson Institute's Economic Policy Studies Group and economic and political columnist Erwin Stelzer will speak next with reflections on Kristol's writings on economics. Madden Jewett, scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and noted bioethicist and biblical commentator Leon Kass will follow, focusing on Kristol's writings on religion. And finally, editor of Weekly Standard, William Kristol, clearly the panelist most indebted to Irving Kristol, will pick up on subjects or issues not addressed by the previous 3. Thank you.
When Irving applied himself either to isolationism or, which was the more important ideological persuasion in foreign affairs, to liberal internationalism, he left little standing when he got through with it. And he was relentless in demolishing the foundations of liberal internationalism, which, generally speaking, is the language of our diplomacy, has been the framework for American foreign policy, with a few exceptions, ever since, for the last century, since Woodrow Wilson. And he describes it as a messianic vision of, quote, subordinating all national interests and national values to the serene judgment of the international community. And in effect, he says, to render it unnecessary for any nation to have a vigorous foreign policy of its own. And he adds, this, of course, is an ancient vision, but it is fair to say that only in our century did statesmen and political philosophers think it a realistic agenda for an unredeemed humanity. And Irving is relentless in taking apart its assumptions. International law, which he describes as one vast fiction, the world community, which by liberal internationalists is defined as a community committed to a universal definition of law and order and civilized behavior, which anybody over the age of 11 will know does not exist. There might be a community of civilized nations in the West that accept certain assumptions, that will agree to take on obligations, but that does not apply abroad. And of course, when we have these universal treaties, universal organizations, which necessarily include the illiberal ones, to say nothing of the rogue states, what it ultimately does is it hampers the civilized and the liberal, because they adhere to the letter and spirit of whatever they sign, and of course it leaves unmolested the will and the malevolence of those who sign a piece of paper and mean nothing. I
Now start with the hopes for a revolution led by the Tea Party. Irving always had a soft spot for populists, perhaps because he saw them as hard-working folks making their way in a world without tenure. I remember when I was preparing this talk, Cedar reminded me of Irving's delight every year when the Rolling Thunder Bikers came to town, not an academic gown in their midst, and only tattoos and American flags. It appealed to him a great deal. At least a decade before the Tea Party populists appeared on the scene, Irving pointed out that such movements in America tend to be anti-big business but not anti-capitalist, which is a very big difference, and that they arise because the structure of our polity and economy make it possible for vox populi to find expression, and that populist conservatism could turn out to be the last best hope of contemporary conservatism. That's in The Right Stuff, which is an interesting piece. So far, so good. But many, especially those in the Right to Life movement, he pointed out, have a tendency to be fanatically determined to make the best the enemy of the good. So keep in mind one of Irving's conclusions, lest you lose heart when failing to clear the first hurdle on the path to undoing the damage, the fiscal and regulatory damage inflicted on our economy in recent years. And the nice thing about in recent years is it's not a number. So you can read it any way you choose. There will surely be defeats ahead, many of them self-inflicted, he wrote. And remember, too, his typically realistic and modest goal of reducing the relative size of the public sector by growing the private sector.
Although Irving says little about the nature of his theotropism, what exactly is his orientation to the divine? And although what he does say he puts only in the negative, parenthesis, impossible to become non-religious, Irving wants readers to understand the primacy and centrality of this theological orientation for his entire life, as well as its being neo-orthodoxy, that is, held with, quote, a degree of detachment qualifying my commitment, unquote. It therefore should come as no surprise that the longest of the 8 sections of the neoconservative persuasion is not about neoconservatism, but about Judaism and Christianity, comprising 9 essays, the most in any section, written over a span of more than 50 years. Most of the essays are not, strictly speaking, theological, but sociological and political. Among them, Liberalism and the American Jews, Christmas, Christians and Jews, Why Religion is Good for the Jews, Taking Religious Conservatives Seriously, The Political Stupidity of the Jews. The analyses here are penetrating, and the problems he addresses have, if anything, become only more serious since the essays calling attention to them were first written. All of them show Irving to be a friend of religion, not only of Judaism but also Christianity, who welcomes the American resurgence of serious religiosity as a necessary corrective to the excesses and restlessness of an aimless secular culture.
But what struck me about this essay was how much it resonates today. He says the United States shares all the evils, all the problems to be found among the Western democracies, sometimes in an exaggerated form, but it is also the only Western democracy that is witnessing a serious conservative revival that is an active response to these evils and problems. The fact that it is a populist conservatism dismays the conservative elites Britain and Western Europe, who prefer a more orderly and dignified kind of conservatism. It dismays a lot of the elites of America, too, I would say, the conservative elites of America. It's true that populism can be a danger to our democratic orders, but it's also true that populism can be a corrective to the defects of democratic order, defects often arising from the intellectual influence and the entrepreneurial politics of our democratic elites. Classical political thought was wary of democracy because it saw the people as fickle, envious, and inherently turbulent. They had no knowledge, the classical thinkers, of democracies where the people were conservative, and the educated elites that governed them were ideological, always busy provoking disorder and discontent in the name of some utopian goal. Populist conservatism is a distinctly modern phenomenon, and conservative thinking has not yet caught up with it. That is why the exceptional kind of conservative politics we're now witnessing in the United States is so important. It could turn out to represent the last best hope of contemporary conservatism. I think that's a very interesting, both very relevant to today, 15 years later, and a very interesting example, if you will, of a certain neoconservative kind of thinking, extremely respectful of classical judgments and thought, but willing to rethink those judgments in light of new circumstances, and in this case come to a guardedly friendly view of populism, of a certain kind of populism in the current political and cultural environment, rather than sort of mechanically applying, you might say, a certain, something that was written 100 or 1,000 years before, 2,000 years before, without taking account of new conditions on the one hand, but without also simply forgetting the wisdom of these older books and older